At the time of making this video, October 10th, 2021, it seems as though the Sony a7IV's release, or at least its official announcement, is imminent. Sony Alpha Rumors is under the impression that Sony's going to release or announce the camera on October 21st, so that gives us about 11 days between now and then. So I just wanted to kind of give you my 2 cents on what I think about the Sony a7IV, what I think about the rumored specifications, and really how it stacks up against the Sony a7S III, and whether it renders the a7S III pretty much meaningless if all these specs turn out to be true. I got the a7S III about 2 months ago now. To be honest, it is my favorite video camera that I've ever shot with. It's not perfect, it definitely has a couple of faults and some oversights that I wish that it would address or could be addressed somehow. But just in terms of capabilities and really image quality, it is my favorite camera that I've ever shot with. I just got it, paid full price for it, and I don't want it to be obsolete in about 11 days. So let's take a look at the latest roundup of specifications that are rumored for the Sony a7IV. All new 33 megapixel sensor, which equates to, in video terms, to around a 7K sensor. So it's going to record internally 4K, so it's going to be downsampled 4K from 7K. Supposedly 15 stops of dynamic range. Dynamic range numbers, especially from manufacturers, are kind of something you should always take with a grain of salt. I believe they're referring to the dynamic range of like raw photos, which doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get the same dynamic range shooting compressed video. But that's definitely in the ballpark of what Sony claims for the a7S III. Internal 10-bit 422. Same body, same cooling solution, and possibly the same articulating screen with the same, I think, 1.2 million dot resolution. All that for around $2,500. Another new rumor is that 4K 60 is going to be possible, but it's going to be in a Super 35 crop mode. So it's going to be downsampled from around 5.8K, I believe, into 4K, again in a Super 35 or APS-C size crop. The same body, you're supposedly going to get the dual UHS-2 and dual CF Express card slots that you get in the a7S III, as well as the full-size HDMI. The EVF is supposedly going to be a big improvement over the a7 III, but it's going to be a far cry from what is in the a7S III, so I think they're saying around 3 million dots for the EVF in comparison to, I think, 9 million dots in the a7S III. And I think those are all the important or relevant rumored specs that we have up to this point. So all of that, taken at face value, is really impressive. If you're just looking at resolution, internal 4K up to 30 frames per second, internal 10-bit 422, that's amazing. And that absolutely does trounce the a7S III, which is only a 12 megapixel camera. So you're looking at almost 3 times the resolution and still getting a downsampled 4K image at 422 10-bit. So here's some things that we don't really know. About that 4K 60, they're saying 10-bit, but they're not saying 422. So is it going to be 10-bit 420 or 10-bit 422? Is that really going to be a big difference? Is it going to make a difference to a lot of people? I can't really answer that. We don't really have any information or even speculation about higher frame rates than 60. So 120 frames per second or 240, for instance. I also haven't really heard anything about autofocus. I mean, the a7 III pretty much had the same autofocus as the A9, which was the current like sports camera from Sony. So they didn't exactly gimp the a7 III in terms of autofocus, which leads me to believe they're probably going to be on par with this autofocusing system in the a7S III, if not even better at this point. Who knows? A couple other things that we don't know about are record limits. The a7 III did have a 30-minute record limit. However, the a7C, which is basically the same camera, just kind of updated body, doesn't have that record limit. I really don't believe at this point that Sony would go back to having a 30-minute record limit. Even if it doesn't have a record limit, I wonder about overheating. The Sony a7S III has been a really great performer in terms of overheating. You really only have to worry about it shooting in really hot conditions at high frame rates, maybe 4K 60, 4K 120, for long periods of time. However, it's only a 12 megapixel sensor, so downsampling that into 4K, it's not exactly as computationally intensive as going from a 7K image or even a 5.8K image, which is going to take a lot more processing power. It's going to generate a lot more heat. And we're looking at the same body, the same cooling solution. I would wager that you're going to have more overheating issues with that camera than you do with the a7S III. Another thing we don't know about, so this is a new sensor that we haven't seen. We're looking at almost 3 times the resolution. What is that going to mean in terms of sensor readout speeds? One of the things that blows me away about the a7S III is the readout speed of the sensor. Sony cameras prior to this had been pretty atrocious, except for I guess the A9. with really slow sensor readouts, with slow processing, which leads to really bad rolling shutter. A7S, a7S2, a7 III, all their APS-C cameras, even the FX9 have kind of slow processing and bad rolling shutter. The a7S III rolling shutter is almost non-existent. It's really, really impressive. It's one of the most impressive things about this camera. So what's it going to be like on the a7 IV? Another question that I have, and this might not really matter to a lot of people in this day and age, is 1080p performance. The a7S cameras all have really, really clean 1080p because you're only going from 12 megapixels down to a 2 megapixel 1080p image, so they're able to do a straight downsample, resulting in a really clean, crisp 1080 image. The higher megapixel Sony cameras do some destructive algorithms in order to get rid of all the extra pixels to give you 1080p. The resulting image is soft. There's a lot of artifacts, moire, things like that in 1080p. If, for instance, the Sony a7 IV does 1080p 120, it's not going to be anywhere near as good as the 4K 120 and the Sony a7S III. And even if you just wanted to record in 1080p for some reason, it's never going to be as good in the Sony a7 IV. I don't think it will be as the a7S III. I think that's everything in terms of the rumors and the specifications. What does all that mean? Does it obsolete the a7S III? I think for a lot of people, it absolutely will, because you are going to get a sharper image up to 4K 30 at least, and it's going to be $1,000 less. Roughly $1,000 less than the a7S III, around $1,200 less than the FX3. In those scenarios where you're just shooting 4K 24 or 4K 30, you're probably going to get a better image out of it. You're also going to get a sharper image at 4K 60, albeit with a 1.5 times crop into the sensor. That may or may not be a factor for you, or may or may not be a big decision point between the two cameras. I think for some people it will, for a lot of people it won't. I'm willing to bet that the a7 IV will have a harder time managing heat than the Sony a7S III. So for people who are shooting in difficult scenarios, then that also might be a consideration. So in a nutshell, I think the Sony a7 IV, like the a7 III before it in 2018, is going to be a beastly YouTuber content creator camera. It's going to be more than sufficient and even better than the a7S III for a lot of different scenarios, and it's going to cost less money. It's going to make a lot of sense for a lot of people, and I think that's going to be fantastic. Given everything that I've said and everything that I don't think that it makes the a7S III obsolete for certain kinds of more professional shooters. And YouTubers are professionals. I don't mean to demean YouTubers as not professionals, but different kinds of professionals. People who are going out to do client work. It's kind of a different type of work or different kind of workflow, has different requirements. I think the a7S III is still going to be an awesome camera and maybe the better solution for a lot of those kinds of peoples. Wedding videographers, for instance, I think this is probably going to be a more reliable camera than the a7 IV. In scenarios where you're not exactly sure what's going to happen, I think this is still going to work better. I can't imagine that the rolling shutter on the a7 IV is going to be as good as this. Movements, sort of like kinetic, frenetic kind of camera moves. This is amazing for that. I don't know if the a7 IV is going to be. I think that would be awesome as a combo. If they match up really well in terms of color, and which they probably will, I could definitely see the a7 IV being like your locked off interview camera, and maybe this could be your B-roll camera, maybe it could be your run and gun handheld camera, you know, depending on what the shoot requires. So I'm excited to see what the official announcements are and what the final specs are of the a7 IV. If Sony's actually going to trounce the a7S III in every way, or if there's going to be some limitations inherent in the camera, or even if Sony's actually going to cripple, quote unquote, some features in the a7 IV so that it doesn't completely cannibalize its own flagship video camera. Let me know what you think. If you have any interest in the a7 IV or even the a7S III, do you have any interest in the a7S III anymore with the a7 IV right around the corner, potentially? Would be interested to hear what you guys think about it. So appreciate you watching the video, and maybe I'll see you in another one.